So you know those emails you get now from companies you bought one product from 6 years ago that start off like, "Hello, name. As we struggle to navigate our new reality in these challenging times, I've been amazed at the ways I've seen people connect and support one another." That's why here at Fruitopia, we're striving to continue bringing you the deliciously groovy best with Strawberry Pat. That awkward corporate pivot from current events to product speak is funny, but a word that stuck out to me is challenging. A word that itself is kind of challenging. It's a loaded word that's a little bit ambiguous and hard to really pin down. It's perfect for the world we're living in now, where things are complicated and the experiences and types of grief we're dealing with varies widely depending on who and where you are. It's challenging to understand what's happening and what we're all going through. But, and here comes my awkward pivot, the word challenging also applies to talking about media. And, even more awkward pivot, it means a whole lot when it comes to a Power Rangers comic book called Beyond the Grid, which was not well received by a lot of readers. But weirdly, what Beyond the Grid is, in terms of both content and real-world context, feels fascinatingly appropriate to the current state of our lives right now. It's a challenging book in terms of how things are presented and executed, about characters in a challenging new reality, where the answers and goals aren't clear, the circumstances are dire, dark, and unprecedented, and the end seems nebulous and impossibly far away if it even exists. A very challenging situation for challenging times. Beyond the Grid was a 9-issue miniseries from 2018 to 2019 in the Mighty Morphin Power Rangers title, coming off of the highly popular crossover event Shattered Grid. It was a self-contained arc using fan-favorite but lesser-known characters in an intentionally different, odder setting with a new artist and the first new writer since the series began in 2016. And then after 9 issues, the beloved writer of the concurrent Go-Go Power Rangers title would take over with a new arc alongside an also beloved previous artist returning. So yeah, even though the first issue did sell out and got a second printing, the odds were still kind of stacked against it to begin with in terms of potential bad fan reaction. On the lead up to the comic, previous writer Kyle Higgins said that one of his favorite comic writer transitions was when Brian Michael Bendis left Daredevil with the title character in prison, and rather than resetting the status quo, the new writer was able to play with this brand new setting and story built in a natural way. And this is what Beyond the Grid was meant to be. As new writer Marguerite Bennett said, Higgins really does leave Daredevil in prison, as they say, so we have to find a way of doing the narrative equivalent of a prison break. And that's what Beyond the Grid is, a story arc heavily set up by the chaotic events of the previous one, but still a very hard turn from what came before. But the truth is that Beyond the Grid is a pretty weird concept for Power Rangers. In short, that a space station containing a metric butt ton of Rangers who had their powers and morphers stolen, who were rescued during the all-out dimension-shattering war that was Shattered Grid, just go with it, have been thrust outside of reality itself and are now floating aimlessly in a mysterious, untethered universe that seems to be slowly dying, with very little life and no connection to the Morphin Grid, meaning the small team of Rangers that does have powers don't have much of their power left. Eventually, they meet a Power Ranger native to this universe, figure out why the universe was untethered from the Morphin Grid to begin with, and do eventually heal the universe. It's about as heady and high concept as you can get, and coupled with a highly stylized, shaded, and line-heavy art style, very hard on its sleeve dialogue, and a dense plot, it's not really a surprise that it didn't hit well with a lot of people. What is a surprise is the extent to which people turned on it, which, again, odds were stacked against it from the start. Now, that's not to say the criticisms aren't warranted. The pacing is a little weird, and there's lots of telling instead of showing, and backloading reveals that we really couldn't spend time with. And a unique challenge is that it has a lot of characters whose arcs we've already seen completed to fruition in their original shows. As a result, this book sort of picks particular qualities each character had or picked up from their time on their original team and has them bring these qualities to this new one, for better or worse. For example, you have Cam from Ninja Storm, having learned the need for humor and lightheartedness from his comedic teammates from the most funny and chill season of the show, and he uses it to uplift this very uber dark and serious team. You also have Tanya, who came from an era of the show where the Rangers were still goody two-shoes and there was no moral ambiguity, and she tries to apply that mindset to a universe full of ambiguities, again, for better or worse. And you have Mike, who was so used to he and his Magna Defender predecessor sacrificing themselves over and over and over again in his original show that he thinks that that's that's about all he has to offer, to the point that it literally turns into a death wish. These and all of the other characters on the main team call back to their original iterations, but in this newer and denser setting, different aspects are highlighted simply because they're playing against different people and different situations, and we don't really dive too heavily into their inner workings, which, again, works better for some characters than it does others. But it does this because Beyond the Grid makes more sense as a broad strokes, theme-heavy, philosophical epic rather than a character-driven story. It's about its message and metaphors and point of view. This isn't that alien to Power Rangers, really. Plenty of seasons are plot or theme-centric rather than character-centric, but the difference here is that its story isn't traditionally straightforward. It is, you guessed it, challenging. Now, when critics say something is challenging, it's meant to be a neutral term. It doesn't mean that it's good or bad or smart or dumb, just that it's more esoteric or obtuse than the norm. And because of how the story is told and executed, digging into the meaning or iteration is a challenge. Abstract art in a lot of indie films are challenging, and sometimes they're challenging because the artist is trying way too hard to be weird, but more times than not, they just have a unique way of conveying what they're trying to convey, or the message and emotions they're trying to convey are just kind of complicated. Look at something like The Matrix and its sequels, the latter of which are generally disliked, but not so much for being like poorly made movies, but more for just being confusing and overly dense and complex. They're very challenging, but you can still find plenty of people who still love them, specifically because they're so dense and complex that it's actually rewarding when you've been able to figure out a coherent meaning or metaphor or narrative after a lot of hard work. It's not for everybody, sure, but you gotta admit it makes sense to feel accomplished after spending time thinking about something and finally getting it in a way that many audiences don't. For example, this book features loads of characters from Power Rangers lore, but only spotlights a few, with a lot of them sort of relegated to the background. This doesn't really matter for readers who aren't familiar with wider Power Rangers lore, but if you are familiar, it's understandable to be a little disappointed when a major character you loved in a previous series is relegated to one panel or one line. And unlike the massive Shattered Grid crossover, where the background Rangers would at least be like doing cool stuff in Ranger form, the point of these characters is to be powerless and deliberately not doing cool Rangery stuff. It's an aspect of this book's concept and storytelling that is inherently going to rub some people the wrong way, and that's fine, but it's not an objective flaw. It's just part of its intentional identity, in the same way that, say, Star Wars having sound effects in the vacuum of space isn't a flaw. It's a conscious stylistic choice, even a small one, and that's part of its identity. If you like realism, it's probably not for you, and you have to either get past that part of it or move on to something else. And likewise, Beyond the Grid's way of telling this broader story with lots of characters is challenging. Not bad, but challenging. Because even if you aren't vibing with the writing or art, it is very obviously not lazy. A clear attempt to dig deeper and do something experimental and different with Power Rangers. And that's something creators only do if they care about the work they're doing. And that alone is worth not writing it off in the way a lot of fandom criticism did and still does. Case in point, before Beyond the Grid was even released, there was a small but significant outrage about openly queer writer and GLAAD Award winner Marguerite Bennett coming aboard as the writer for fear that she would make Power Rangers gay, something very extremely impossible. And yet, hilariously, when introducing queer Solar Ranger Ari and her love interest Remy, those same people apparently didn't even realize it, given the headlines and shock when it was spelled out in Ari's bio in a video game months later. It suggests that a lot of those complaining fandom voices either weren't paying much attention or didn't bother to read until the end at all, where these elements and the arc's entire theme and purpose is super clarified, which is a bummer because for years, Power Rangers fans have been clamoring for more complex, mature, and challenging stories that aren't heavily tied to Mighty Morphin and that take advantage of the larger universe and rich history. And yet that exact type of story was openly derided in Beyond the Grid, as well as in the also unfairly panned graphic novel The Psychopath, which is thus far the only other Power Rangers comic to be written by an openly queer person. Weird how that works, right? The truth is simply that different types of artists with different life experiences tell different types of stories. Not every long-running franchise is handled like, say, the Marvel Cinematic Universe, where those in charge keep a very tight grasp on the narratives, tone, and look of every film. Many long-running franchises like Power Rangers feature tons of voices and contributions and changes throughout its existence. When a larger universe or franchise is built from collective or corporate parties, rather than a singular creator or group of creators, it means anytime an iteration differs from the perceived norm, it's going to be inherently challenging. Something like Beyond the Grid is clearly made with a very particular particular voice, vision, point of view, and sensibility, with that voice conveyed by its creator's particular styles that may not necessarily work for every reader. And the challenge to we as readers is that we be open to learn from these different voices and take in these new experiences, with the hope that it will help you expand your own perspective, whether by letting you see things in your own life or world around you that you hadn't thought about before, or to help you process your own experiences by connecting with the voice of the creator and the resulting art. And if your thought is, that stuff doesn't really belong in Power Rangers, well, you got like 900 episodes waiting for it on Netflix, you're fine. The thing that's sort of miraculous about Beyond the Grid is that it reflects a lot of internal struggles people have had for the past few years, and feels even more relevant in our current circumstances. The Beyond the Grid Rangers face a universe where there are no spiritual mentors to guide them, and all the Power Rangery methods of believing in yourself and showing courage and getting a new battleizer, it just isn't enough to solve their problem. They're characters from a universe where the good guys always win, transplanted into one where they can't possibly win. No end in sight, no easy solution, just trapped on a dying world on a space station they can barely leave, with nothing to do other than stew in their own anxiety without being able to sleep a wink at night and only find enough energy to watch Netflix all day, survive. While we follow a main team of Rangers that move the plot forward and kind of anchor everything in the traditional sense, there are two keys to the story that really unlock what it's all actually about. One is the powerless background Rangers. Early in the arc, they're seen taking on different roles on the space station, working together to stay alive, but as the arc progresses, there are a few moments where these characters express some jealousy towards the main team. But in issue 36, we get a really nice montage showing these powerless Rangers going above and beyond, saving all the even more powerless citizens of this dying universe from multiple catastrophes. The comic spends many issues repeatedly reinforcing just how incessantly hopeless it all is for our Rangers. We've seen in plenty of post-apocalyptic movies and in real life that at times of crisis bring out both the best and worst in people. But Beyond the Grid isn't your typical dystopian scenario, because the Rangers are, ultimately, all meant to be the best of us, Ranger powers or not. They're still flawed and slave to their emotions and jealousies at times, but ultimately, when push comes to shove, they're self-sacrificing and cooperative. Despite facing near constant nihilistic despair and failure, and even in the face of having no powers, they never stop trying to find people in need and make life better for them however they can. The other key to this book is probably a big reason why so many readers had trouble connecting with it, is that it wasn't really the story of the main Ranger team at all. It's the story of Ari the Solar Ranger, and Praetor the main villain, and the parallel between the two. We learn that Praetor was once an ancient Morphin master, the sort of benevolent god-like guardians of the Power Rangers universe, and when they learned of a planet of Zeo crystals, which was both linked to the Morphin grid and also possessed the power to basically destroy all reality if in the wrong hands, they decided to cut off a slice of the multiverse from the rest of reality to make it impossible for any bad guys to get to, thus creating this dying Beyond the Grid universe. Praetor was the Morphin Master who volunteered to stay in this dying universe with a group of Rangers to keep an eye on it, with the hope that there would one day be a better solution to reattach this universe to reality. But over time, he realized that there would be no solution to do so, and this universe would truly die, as would all its residents. And he started to despise his team of Rangers for still trying to make some kind of small difference, even though they were facing inevitable death and hopelessness. And eventually he became a vengeful, jealous, resentful monster, hell-bent on squashing any semblance of hope until the universe died. Praetor's tragic flaw was the fear that nothing he did mattered, that making the ultimate sacrifice to come to this dying universe was pointless, since there was never going to be a solution outside of death anyway. Or rather, he was resentful that what he did would simply never be enough. That if the happy ending isn't 100%, if the universe ultimately dies, even if his Ranger team could have made the lives in that universe better, he felt like it would still never be worth it because he was so obsessed with the bigger picture. We see these parallels in other characters too. In Heckle's Ranger origin in issue 35, we learn he was obsessed with the idea that he wasn't doing enough to protect his planet, unable to accept his own limitations and understand the significance of what he could do, and he let his anxiety and obsession with needing to do more consume him until he nearly doomed everyone anyway. But it's Ari's arc that brings this all together. She, conversely, knows she should do good and try to make a difference, and has a specific task and the capabilities to do so. But she feels utterly alone and overwhelmed at that prospect, collapsing under the emotional weight of being, presumably, the one and only person that can do anything. I think about all our global crises at any given time, even before the current one, and how, as one human, I might try to do my part in, recycling and voting and buying local and donating to charities or whatever, but it's easy to read the news and constantly think, what's the point? If I'm not even making a tiny smidgen of a difference, ultimately, how is there any hope? And as more and more global crises pop up and I feel more and more powerless to the point that the most good I can do is to literally not do anything at all, and yet everything still seems to be perpetually getting worse, the inevitability that nothing matters and we're all just flailing into hellfire is kind of hard to get past. But Beyond the Grid reflects a philosophy that I've found comfort in, that of optimistic nihilism, which, like in the world of Beyond the Grid, is founded in the idea that it's okay to acknowledge that the universe fundamentally does not care about you. As the educational series Kurzgesagt defines it, we're not at the center of what we call the universe. We're just another temporary stage in a history going back over 1 billion years. This story is not about us. This probably triggers existential dread in you, but unlike full-on Nietzschean nihilism, the optimistic part of this philosophy is that we as individuals have both the freedom and the power to create our own meanings in that meaninglessness. You can find this idea in the works of Viktor E. Frankl, who wrote about his desire and ability to stay alive and sane during the Holocaust by striving to find some sort of meaning in his life even during the worst of circumstances. His tenets of logotherapy dictate that the most powerful, most motivating force in humanity is our individual desire to find meaning. And as Kurzgesagt says, if the universe has no principles, the only principles relevant are the ones we decide on. If the universe has no purpose, then we get to dictate what its purpose is. We are truly free in a universe-sized playground, so we might as well aim to be happy and to build some kind of utopia in the stars. The dying universe of Beyond the Grid is sort of a microcosm of our own fleeting existence in our universe. There is no particular end goal, and the bad guy is only bad because he realized how hopeless it was to be good. Because just vaguely being good doesn't really mean anything in a universe without any guiding forces or principles. But it is still full of experiences people can find meaning from, as is our own universe. So when faced with the question of what do you do when it feels like nothing you do matters, Beyond the Grid's answer to this is twofold. For one, no matter how powerless you think you are, even the tiniest smidgen of a difference you make means something and can eventually lead to a bigger change. And number two, you're not doing it alone. The Power Rangers of Beyond the Grid are isolated, separated from their teams, mentors, powers, and worlds, and Ari never had a team to begin with. In many ways, they are all fundamentally alone, but they still learn that they can be alone together. They spend what might be their last few months alive in awful, uncertain circumstances, helping other people and making the lives of everyone else better, safer, and longer, even if everything in the universe is telling them that it's pointless and may only get worse. In their horrible circumstances, they find meaning in connecting and helping, and after all, there are so many people to help. Where Beyond the Grid succeeds is in its idea that, even among uncertainty, and even when we feel utterly powerless to make any sort of difference, and even when we're in challenging times and we don't know when it will end or what the world will look like if it ever does, it's making the choice to connect with others and make a positive difference at all, in whatever capacity we can, that matters in the end.